Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight.
Let the mystery begin.
The rain had begun before dusk, a slow, mournful drizzle that shrouded the village of St. Mary Mead in a veil of silver melancholy. It clung to the thatched roofs, glimmered on cobblestones, and whispered against windows like the faint sigh of old secrets trying to be heard once more. Inside the vicarage, the air smelled faintly of beeswax polish and sponge cake, the latter still cooling on a tray near the open window. The scent of sugar and almonds drifted into the chill of the evening. From the parlour came the faint crackle of the wireless, a string quartet playing something tender and polite. But it could not quite smother the low hum of tension that hung in the house tonight, for tonight was meant to be a celebration. And yet an unease had crept in, as though the walls themselves disapproved of cheer. Mrs. Partridge's birthday had always been a village affair. 80 years old and still sharp as a knitting needle, she ruled her garden, her bridge club, and her opinions with imperious charm. Her niece, Miss Lydia Partridge, had arranged a small gathering. Just a few friends, and dear Miss Marple, of course. It was to be an evening of laughter, cake, and sherry, nothing more. Yet as the clock struck 7 and the first guests arrived, there was something unusually brittle in the air. The laughter felt forced, the eyes darting. The polite compliments were armour against some unspoken fear. Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly by the hearth, noticed all of it, every glance, every hesitation, every small untruth folded neatly into conversation. There is always a reason for falsity, she thought mildly, folding her hands over her knitting. Sometimes a kind one, sometimes not. The door swung open. A gust of wind scattered the papers on the writing desk, and a tall gentleman entered. Colonel Harcourt, retired, florid-faced, and overly genial. Behind him came Dr. Lionel Graves, his spectacles glinting, his manner brisk. Then the widow, Mrs. Fleming, dressed too heavily for comfort, and always smiling a second too late. The room filled with the murmurs of greeting. Candles flickered on the cake, a grand creation of pink icing and almond roses. Lydia fussed over the matches, her hands trembling slightly as she struck one.
80 candles, Auntie! Imagine!
Mrs. Partridge chuckled in her chair, her shawl drawn close.
80 indeed. I've lived long enough to see nearly all my enemies buried. But not all. Alas! A ripple of laughter followed, awkward and brittle, as the lights dimmed for the singing.
Miss Marple's eyes wandered. To the table where the cake rested, to the cutlery polished so perfectly, to the small glass of sherry that Mrs. Fleming had placed beside her plate. The song began.
Happy birthday to you.
Then came the candles. Small wavering flames reflected in a dozen pairs of eyes. Mrs. Partridge took a deep breath and blew them out. Smoke curled upward, thin and ghostly. Lydia clapped.
Now, Auntie, a slice for everyone.
The cake was cut, laughter resumed, and sherry glasses clinked. But when Miss Marple took her piece, just a sliver, out of politeness, she noticed something odd. A faint, bitter scent beneath the sugar, as though something had spoiled in the almond paste. She did not eat, nor did she miss the way Mrs. Partridge's smile faded, the way her hand trembled as she lifted her fork. Moments later, there was a silence so thick it seemed the rain itself paused to listen. The old woman gasped, clutched her throat, and fell forward onto the table, her teacup shattering as it rolled to the floor. A scream broke the stillness. Lydia's voice, sharp, frantic.
Auntie, Auntie, speak to me.
Dr. Graves hurried forward, his hands steady but his face drained of colour. She's gone, he whispered, after a long, dreadful moment. It's her heart, perhaps. Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression unreadable. The candles flickered again, throwing long, restless shadows across the cake. The almond scent hung heavy in the air, cloying, suffocating, and, as the guests froze in shock, the old clock in the corner struck 8. Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the rain traced thin silver veins down the glass.
No, she thought quietly, not the heart.
Something else entirely. Outside, the wind rose, howling through the hedgerows like some mournful herald. The party was over, and a darker night had begun. Chapter. The following morning dawned in pale, uncertain light. The rain had ceased some time before dawn, leaving behind the faint scent of damp earth and sodden leaves. A thin mist hovered over the hedgerows, and the bells of St. Mary Mead Church tolled faintly in the distance. A Sunday morning, like any other, except that the air carried the weight of tragedy. At the Partridge home, the curtains remained drawn. The house, which had once brimmed with laughter and gossip, now stood still as a photograph, every shadow motionless, every creak of the wood floor louder than it ought to be. In the parlour, Lydia Partridge sat in a crumpled state, her eyes red from a night of weeping. A constable, young and solemn, stood near the fireplace, while Inspector Cray, a tall man with a weary moustache and a manner of polite suspicion, questioned her in low tones. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, observed everything as unobtrusively as ever. She had been invited to stay the night after the unfortunate event, though she suspected it was less an invitation and more a subtle instruction from the local authorities, who knew of her uncanny eye for detail. "Now, Miss Partridge," Inspector Cray said gently, "you said your aunt seemed in good health before the celebration?"
Yes, Inspector, Lydia replied, clutching her handkerchief.
She complained only of her knees now and then. Nothing serious. Dr. Graves himself said she was as strong as an ox. Cray turned toward the doctor, who sat nearby, polishing his spectacles with a rather nervous persistence. "Doctor, you were present when she collapsed?" "I was," Dr. Graves replied, his tone clinical but tense. "It was instantaneous." "A seizure," I thought. "Or perhaps her heart simply failed." "She was elderly, after all," Miss Marple spoke softly. "And yet, Dr. Graves, she had seemed quite sprightly earlier in the evening. I recall her laughing most heartily at Colonel Harcourt's tale of the bishop and the champagne." The inspector gave a faint smile. "Indeed, Miss Marple, you've an excellent memory." She nodded modestly. "One tries to listen." Cray turned back to the doctor. "You didn't notice anything peculiar before the collapse? Any sign of distress, choking, or nausea?" Dr. Graves hesitated.
"No, well, yes, perhaps."
She coughed once, as though something caught in her throat. "But that can happen to anyone of age." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright.
"I noticed a certain smell, Inspector. Very faint."
"Like bitter almonds." The room fell quiet. Inspector Cray looked at her sharply. "Bitter almonds, you say?" "Yes, it came from the cake, I think." The inspector and the doctor exchanged a look. "That," murmured Cray, "could suggest cyanide." Dr. Graves swallowed.
"Surely not. Who would—" "It's unthinkable." Miss Marple folded her hands primly. "Unthinkable, yes."
"But not impossible. The laboratory tests came back the next afternoon. The cake contained traces of potassium cyanide, unmistakable and fatal." Inspector Cray's face was grim as he read the report.
"Poison in the birthday cake," he muttered.
"And a house full of guests who all had reason to smile while she died." He and Miss Marple sat together in the vicarage parlour, where the kindly vicar had offered them tea. Rain pattered again against the window-pane. "Let's list them, Miss Marple," Cray said. "For clarity's sake, Lydia Partridge, the niece, inherited everything, so there's motive enough. Dr. Graves had access to chemicals and was rather quick to pronounce her dead. Mrs. Fleming, friend of the deceased, though I gather there'd been some quarrel over a loan unpaid. And Colonel Harcourt, old army man, fond of his brandy, and rumoured to have lost a good deal of money in a failed business some years ago. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Quite a catalogue of human nature, Inspector.
Love, debt, and vanity. It's all the usual culprits. Cray looked faintly amused.
You make it sound inevitable. In my experience, said Miss Marple, wickedness is like mildew. It grows wherever the light of honesty is faint. The inspector smiled. And perhaps you'll help me shine a little of that light. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the partridge house once more. It had been sealed for investigation, but Lydia, pale and drawn, allowed her in. I hardly know what to do, Miss Marple, Lydia said, twisting a lace handkerchief.
Everything's been dreadful.
The police, the questions.
I can hardly bear it. My dear, Miss Marple said kindly, you've suffered a great shock.
But if your aunt's death was indeed deliberate, then it would be far worse to let it go unanswered. Lydia shuddered.
I can't think who could have done it. She wasn't loved by everyone, I know, but...
She didn't deserve that. Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the sideboard, where the remnants of the cake lay covered by a muslin cloth.
Tell me, Lydia, who baked the cake?
Mrs. Fleming did, Lydia said at once. She offered. Said it was her gift, indeed. And did anyone else touch it before it was served? I don't think so, except perhaps me when I carried it in. Miss Marple lifted a corner of the cloth. The cake, once proud and pink, now looked tragic and crumbling. A faint trace of icing clung to the knife beside it. Strange, isn't it? Murmured Miss Marple, how something meant to bring joy can so easily turn to sorrow. Lydia's eyes filled again. Do you think it was meant for her, Miss Marple? Miss Marple looked up gently. Poison rarely lands where it is not aimed, my dear, but we must be very sure of whom it was aimed at. That evening, as twilight descended over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, a single candle flickering beside her teacup. The scent of wet lilacs drifted through the open pane. She took a small notebook and wrote, in neat, deliberate script, Mrs. Partridge. Victim, cyanide poisoning. Cake baked by Mrs. Fleming. Lydia. Motive, inheritance, Dr. Graves. Access to chemicals. Colonel Harcourt. Debt, opportunity. She paused. Then below it she wrote, but what of kindness? Who benefits from sympathy, not gain? Who stands to profit from pity? The flame trembled slightly as she closed her notebook. Outside, in the stillness of the evening, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden, and then all was quiet again. Miss Marple sipped her tea and looked toward the church spire fading into the mist. Somewhere, among those gentle souls and polished manners, a murderer waited, calm, unsuspected, and perhaps even smiling. Chapter 2. The next morning found St. Mary Mead awash in pale sunlight, deceptive in its warmth, for beneath the quiet charm of the hedgerows and the clink of milk bottles lay the slow pulse of curiosity and dread. Word had spread, as it always did, faster than the milk cart could make its rounds. By breakfast every household knew old Mrs. Partridge had been poisoned, on her birthday, no less. At the post office, voices murmured with barely concealed relish. At the bakery, speculation rose with the smell of warm bread. And in every whisper Miss Marple's name surfaced, that gentle lady with the sharp eyes and sharper understanding of human nature. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Cray had returned to the Partridge house, armed with notebooks, quiet determination, and a respect for the elderly spinster whose insights had already proved alarmingly prescient in past inquiries. The parlour looked just as it had the night of the celebration, except colder, emptier. The birthday ribbons drooped, faded already. The air smelled faintly of wax and wilted flowers. Inspector Cray stood by the table where the cake had once been proudly displayed. "We've had the kitchen examined," he said. "The poison was in the icing, not in the cake itself. Whoever introduced it did so after baking, Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the icing was added by Mrs. Fleming, I believe. So she claims. Says she made it the evening before and stored it in her larder. Then she could hardly be certain no one tampered with it, said Miss Marple mildly. Rural kitchens are not so impervious as people imagine. Doors unlocked, neighbours friendly. One may borrow sugar and leave behind death without notice. Cray raised an eyebrow. You suspect a visitor? I suspect opportunity, she replied. The motive will tell us who. But opportunity, my dear Inspector, tells us when. He smiled faintly. Then let's begin with both. Mrs. Fleming lived 2 streets away in a small house overflowing with geraniums and self-pity. Her sitting room was stiflingly perfumed, her lace curtains yellowed with age. She received Miss Marple and Inspector Cray with an air of wounded dignity. I cannot believe this is happening, she said, dabbing her eyes. Poor dear Beatrice Partridge, after all our years of friendship. To think her last taste in this world was my cake. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. A kind gesture, Mrs. Fleming, one that no one could have foreseen turning so tragic. The woman preened slightly.
I pride myself on my baking. Everyone says my icing is the smoothest in the parish. Did you have any callers that day?
Asked Cray. Mrs. Fleming hesitated.
Only the milkman and...
Oh yes, Dr. Graves dropped by. He wanted to see my garden.
He's very fond of roses, Dr. Graves.
Cray repeated. Yes, yes. Said he was passing by after his rounds. We talked a few minutes, then he went off. Nothing sinister, Inspector, I assure you. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly behind her spectacles. You keep your kitchen window open when you bake, don't you, Mrs. Fleming? Why, yes, of course. The steam and all that, I see. When they left the cottage, Cray muttered. Graves again. He seems to appear everywhere, doesn't he? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Doctors often do, Inspector. It is part of their nature to be omnipresent, and sometimes, to their misfortune, omniscient. Dr. Graves's surgery stood on the corner by the green, neat, efficient, and faintly sterile. The man himself looked composed, but his fingers tapped the desk restlessly as they spoke. I won't deny I visited Mrs. Fleming, he said, but it was purely social. Her garden's famous for its roses, and I've an interest in horticulture. Were you aware she was baking that day? Asked Cray. Graves hesitated. I might have seen some bowls in the kitchen, yes. But I assure you I didn't go near them. Miss Marple leaned forward. You have access to potassium cyanide, Doctor.
Used, I believe, in small amounts for cleaning gold instruments?
Yes, he admitted. But it's kept locked.
Only I have the key. Yet, said Miss Marple softly, even a locked drawer is no defence against carelessness.
Was it locked that day? He swallowed. I believe so. Believe, she repeated kindly, is such a frail word for so grave a matter. Dr. Graves looked at her sharply, then sighed. Miss Marple, do you think me guilty?
I think, she said, that everyone who hides behind indignation is usually shielding something, though not always guilt.
Sometimes only fear. When they left the surgery, Inspector Cray said, You think he's lying? Perhaps. But not about everything. The Colonel lived alone in a handsome but decaying house at the end of the lane. His drawing room smelled of tobacco and old medals. Beastly business, he said gruffly. Didn't like the old girl much, but wouldn't wish her that. You attended the party? Said Cray. Of course.
Out of decency. Lydia insisted. Did you eat any cake? A bit of it.
Didn't care for the taste.
Too strong, like almonds gone off. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully.
You have a fine decanter on your sideboard, Colonel. May I? He nodded, puzzled as she examined it. Bitter almonds, she murmured.
A curious coincidence, is it not?
The Colonel frowned. What do you mean? I mean, she said gently, that in certain liqueurs, amaretto for instance, one may find a flavouring remarkably akin to cyanide in scent. I wonder, Colonel, were you perhaps responsible for the sherry glasses that evening? He looked startled. Why, yes, I poured them myself. But surely you don't think... Miss Marple smiled faintly.
Oh, I think nothing yet, Colonel. Only that scent is a curious guide. It leads one either to poison or perfume, and sometimes both.
Lydia met them in her aunt's garden, dressed in black and pale as chalk. The roses drooped under the weight of dew. "I've been going through her papers," she said softly.
She kept everything, letters, receipts, even gossip cut from the newspaper. May I?
Miss Marple asked gently, indicating the papers. Of course. There's nothing in them of importance. But there was. Miss Marple saw it at once. Among the letters, an envelope marked in Mrs. Partridge's tight, spidery hand, "To be opened in the event of my death." Cray exhaled sharply. "Well, that makes things simpler." They opened it. Inside was a single sheet. "If anything should befall me, I wish it known that I have recently altered my will. Lydia is to inherit all. But I fear resentment from others who thought themselves entitled. Beatrice Fleming in particular has grown strange. There was a quarrel over money last week." Lydia's lips trembled. "I didn't know she wrote this."
I swear it. Miss Marple's voice was calm.
"Grief often blinds us, my dear. But truth seldom hides for long." She turned to the inspector. "You see now, Cray, Mrs. Fleming's gift of cake was not merely kindness. It was also a test." Cray frowned.
A test?
"Yes, I think Mrs. Partridge suspected danger, and wanted to see who would serve it to her, or perhaps who would not." That evening, as the sun sank in crimson splendour over the village, Miss Marple sat once more at her writing desk. Her notebook lay open. She wrote, "Poison added after baking, opportunity, Mrs. Fleming, Dr. Graves, Colonel, Sherry, Lydia, transport. Will changed recently, motive expanding, but the act itself, too crude for Mrs. Fleming, too cowardly for Harcourt, too clever for Lydia, too risky for Graves." She paused, her pen hovering. Unless, she thought, it was not meant for Mrs. Partridge at all. The candle beside her flickered, and the scent of wax filled the quiet room.
Outside, a clock struck 10, and somewhere in the distance,
a train whistle sounded mournful and far away. Chapter 3. Morning came cool and brittle, sunlight cutting through the mist like the blade of a knife. St. Mary Mead had never seemed so still, nor its tidy hedges so watchful. It was as though every gable, every neat curtain, every chimney whispered behind closed lips, "Who poisoned the cake?" Miss Marple, however, looked entirely untroubled. She sat by her window, sipping tea and watching the postman's slow bicycle as he made his rounds. Her expression was serene, but her thoughts were as quick and precise as the ticking clock on her mantel. "Poison is always personal," she mused. "Knives are for passion. Poison is for patience." She set down her cup and drew open her notebook once more. On one page she had written the word motives in neat capital letters. Beneath it she had listed each suspect. And today she meant to test every one of them. Mrs. Partridge's funeral was held that afternoon, a sombre affair beneath a pewter sky. The church was full, as such occasions always were. Death drew more company than life ever could. The villagers came dressed in respectful black, their faces solemn, but their eyes sharp with curiosity. The choir sang softly, their voices echoing through the nave. Miss Marple sat near the back, her delicate hands folded upon her lap. Inspector Cray stood near the door, his face unreadable. When the service ended, the mourners spilled into the churchyard, where the drizzle had returned, thin, cold, persistent. Lydia Partridge stood apart, her veil trembling slightly in the wind. Mrs. Fleming approached her with exaggerated sympathy. "My dear girl, such a dreadful loss," she cooed. Lydia's expression tightened. "Thank you, Mrs. Fleming." Miss Marple watched them carefully. There was no embrace, no genuine warmth.
Only words, brittle, rehearsed. Then Dr. Graves appeared, offering Lydia his arm. "Come, my dear, you should rest," he said gently.
"Grief will exhaust you if you let it." Mrs. Fleming's eyes narrowed. "You're very attentive, Doctor." Dr. Graves inclined his head. Purely concern for a patient's health, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Health indeed, she thought. And what of the health of the soul, Doctor? That, I fear, may not be as easily mended. That evening, Lydia brought Miss Marple a small parcel. I found this among Aunt's things, she said quietly. I thought you might like to see it. It was a letter, sealed and unposted. The handwriting trembled with age. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. My dear Lionel, you have been kind and I am not ungrateful. But your attentions toward my niece are unwelcome. She is too young, too gentle to understand your intentions, and I must insist that you desist. I trust you will take this as it is meant. Not unkindly, but firmly. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Partridge. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed.
My, she murmured. How very interesting. Lydia looked confused.
I didn't know Aunt wrote to him. Nor perhaps did he, Miss Marple said. For see, it was never sent. And yet it speaks volumes, does it not? Your aunt was protecting you, Lydia flushed.
Protecting me? From what?
From affection misdirected, said Miss Marple softly. Men sometimes confuse admiration with possession. Lydia looked down. Dr. Graves was
attentive, yes.
But I never encouraged him. Miss Marple nodded, folding the letter. Then I imagine your aunt's firmness would have been quite the humiliation to him, especially for a man of pride. Later that same day, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Fleming again. She found her in the garden pruning her roses with violent precision. They'll never bloom properly this season, Mrs. Fleming grumbled. Too much damp. Ah, said Miss Marple mildly. But sometimes, my dear, it's not the weather that stifles growth. It's what lies beneath the roots. Mrs. Fleming frowned. You've a way of making simple things sound ominous. Experience, said Miss Marple, kneeling to examine a flower bed. Tell me, Mrs. Fleming, how long had you and Mrs. Partridge been
at odds? The woman stiffened.
We were friends, yes, and yet she noted in her papers that there was a quarrel. Mrs. Fleming's shears paused mid-air. Over money, that's all. She lent me a small sum years ago. I offered to repay it, but she refused. Said I should instead show gratitude, whatever that means. Perhaps she meant loyalty, said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Fleming's eyes hardened.
Loyalty?
She humiliated me in front of others, made it sound as though I begged. You didn't, I'm sure, Miss Marple said kindly. But pride is a dangerous thing. It often tempts us to strike where gratitude should grow. Mrs. Fleming turned away. You think I did it? I think, said Miss Marple, you've been wronged, and that kind hearts, once bruised, may turn bitter. Like almonds, perhaps. For a moment silence hung between them, heavy as fog. Then Mrs. Fleming whispered, She deserved to be frightened, but not that. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Then perhaps someone else was listening to your anger, Mrs. Fleming, and took it upon themselves to act. Inspector Cray returned from town that evening with a sheaf of papers and a grim expression. You were right to mention Harcourt, Miss Marple. He was deeply in debt, owed money to Mrs. Partridge. She'd lent him a considerable sum 5 years ago, and only last month she threatened to call it in. Ah, said Miss Marple, so another motive blooms. She kept a record of every loan. The Colonel forged her signature once, tried to cover it. She found out. He begged her not to tell. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. He would not kill for shame. But for ruin? Possibly, Cray nodded. He was the last to pour sherry that night. The glasses were tested. No trace of poison. Then he may not have administered death, said Miss Marple, but he might have delivered it, unknowingly. Perhaps through the drink, perhaps through kindness. She looked thoughtful. There's a certain irony, Inspector, in how often kindness becomes the vehicle for cruelty. The next morning, Miss Marple called on Dr. Graves once more. She found him pale and irritable, pacing his study. You persist, Miss Marple, he said bitterly. You think me a monster? On the contrary, she said pleasantly, I think you a man of great vanity, which is far less than monstrous, though sometimes just as dangerous. His face darkened. "What do you want?" She set the letter, the one addressed to him, upon the desk. "To know if you ever received this." He stared, then shook his head.
"No, but I suspected as much."
"She despised me. She protected her niece," Miss Marple said softly.
"A woman's instinct," he gave a dry laugh.
"And what did it earn her?"
A coffin. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver.
"Do you often speak so bitterly of your patients, Doctor?" He looked away. "You wouldn't understand." "I understand more than you think," she said gently. "A wounded pride will justify any cruelty, especially when wrapped in the name of love." There was a long silence. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "I didn't mean for her to eat it. It was meant for Lydia." Miss Marple's breath caught.
"For Lydia?"
He nodded, trembling. "I only wanted to make her ill, just enough that she'd need me. Depend on me. I put it in her slice, the one next to hers, but she passed it to her aunt, saying she was full."
"It was an accident, I swear it." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly.
A tragic irony indeed. When she opened them, her gaze was calm, sorrowful. "And so," she murmured, "love has once again become the most poisonous thing of all." That evening, Miss Marple sat alone at her writing desk, the candle burning low. The case was clearer now, yet her heart felt heavy. She wrote in her neat, unwavering hand, Graves intended harm for Lydia, not murder of Mrs. Partridge. Motive, obsession, disguised as affection. Poison administered in cake. Intended slice switched. Tragedy of chance. Born from wickedness of desire. She closed her notebook gently. Outside, the wind rose again, sighing through the apple trees. In the distance, thunder rolled, soft and distant, like a warning murmured through the hills. Miss Marple looked toward the dark horizon, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Evil seldom knows itself until it sees what it has done. Chapter 4. The storm that broke over St. Mary Mead that night seemed almost biblical in its force, thunder cracking like the heavens themselves had taken a stand against deceit. Rain hammered on the rooftops, washing the village lanes clean of gossip, or so it seemed. But truth, Miss Marple reflected as she sat in her parlour, is not so easily cleansed. It clings, like damp or guilt. She had sat long into the night after Dr. Graves's confession, the candle burning low beside her notes. Yet something troubled her deeply. His story, though convincing, bore the faint scent of incompletion, the sort of half-truth that good people tell when trying to make their evil appear smaller, more bearable. He wished to harm, not to kill, she thought, and yet his victim was not the one who fell. But is intent alone the whole truth, or merely its shadow? The next morning she decided the time had come for a new kind of test, not of fact, but of conscience. Inspector Cray called at breakfast, looking as though the storm had worn him down. His overcoat was damp, his eyes weary, Graves confessed. "But not to murder," he said. "We'll have to see what the Crown Prosecutor says, but—"
"It's odd, isn't it?"
"His story ties the bow, but it doesn't quite hold the ribbon," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You feel it too, Inspector. That small, loosened thread," Cray sighed. "The poison! It was in the icing. He claims he dosed a single portion, but the laboratory found traces spread unevenly throughout the top layer, not concentrated in one slice. That suggests either the icing was poisoned before it was spread, or someone else touched it later." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "So perhaps Dr. Graves tells a partial truth, enough to clear his conscience, but not enough to damn another. You think he's protecting someone?" "I think," she said, pouring him tea, "he's a man still tangled in his own vanity, and vanity, Inspector, is a cousin of cowardice." Later that day, Miss Marple visited Lydia once more. The younger woman looked worn, but there was a strange steadiness in her eyes now, as though grief had hardened into quiet strength. "I hear the doctor has confessed," she said without surprise. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but the confession may not be as simple as it seems." Lydia nodded faintly. "I suppose nothing ever is with you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Life is seldom simple, my dear."
Especially when money and affection intertwine, Lydia stiffened.
"Money? You are now quite wealthy, Lydia. But I wonder, did you know your aunt changed her will twice?" Lydia blinked. "Twice?" "Yes, the first, leaving everything to you. The second, unsigned, leaving half to Mrs. Fleming." Lydia stared at her. "But why would she?" "Because she pitied Mrs. Fleming," Miss Marple said. "And because, perhaps, she had begun to doubt you." Lydia's face went pale.
"Doubt me? I loved her. I believe you did," said Miss Marple kindly.
"But love, as we've seen, can be most cruel when mixed with desperation." That afternoon, as the rain returned in fine needles, Mrs. Fleming arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's cottage. Her hat was soaked through, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I had to speak with you," she said breathlessly. "I've remembered something." "Do sit down, my dear," said Miss Marple, gesturing to the armchair. "What troubles you?"
"It's the doctor," Mrs. Fleming said.
"He came to see me again the day before the party. Said he wanted to discuss Mrs. Partridge's health."
"But now I realize when he was watching me ice the cake." "Watching you?" "Yes, standing by the door pretending to admire the roses."
"He said I shouldn't use so much almond essence, it might overpower the taste. But I didn't listen." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And you used the same spoon to stir and taste?" "Yes, of course." "Then, my dear Mrs. Fleming," Miss Marple murmured, "I think we've just uncovered the method, if not yet the soul, of the crime." That evening, a knock came at the vicarage door.
Colonel Harcourt stood there, hat in hand, his expression drawn. "I've been a fool," he said quietly.
"You should know the truth, Miss Marple." She invited him in. "It's about the loan," he continued. "Mrs. Partridge caught me forging her signature, yes, but she promised to forgive it if I'd help her in something peculiar. She wanted to trap the doctor. Said he'd been too attentive to Lydia and she feared for her. She asked me to pretend to be in debt, to distract him, make him careless." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "She used you as bait." He nodded miserably.
"I thought it harmless, but now, if I'd refused, then perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "he would have found another way to impress the young lady."
And another tragedy would have followed. Inspector Cray returned that night with startling news. Graves's surgery assistant, young Mr. Ellis, came forward. Says he noticed the cyanide vial missing 2 days before the party. Not one. The doctor said he was cleaning instruments, but Ellis swears he never saw it returned. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed.
2 days before.
Then the poison could have been taken, used, and replaced by someone else entirely. Who?
"Someone who visited Mrs. Fleming's kitchen that day," said Miss Marple quietly.
Someone who knew the doctor's habits.
"Someone who wanted to see him blamed? Lydia?"
Cray asked incredulously. Possibly.
"But I must be sure."
And for that, Inspector, we shall need one final performance. The next evening, Miss Marple invited all 4 suspects, Lydia, Dr. Graves, Mrs. Fleming, and Colonel Harcourt, to the vicarage under pretext of discussing Mrs. Partridge's will. The parlour was warm and softly lit by candlelight. Tea steamed on the table. The rain whispered beyond the window panes. "My friends," Miss Marple began, "we are gathered to bring peace to the memory of poor Mrs. Partridge, but peace requires truth." Dr. Graves looked uneasy. Lydia's face was unreadable. Mrs. Fleming fidgeted with her gloves. The Colonel stood stiffly near the mantel. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed.
"Inspector Cray has discovered new evidence."
The poison was handled 2 days before the celebration. "So, Doctor, your confession cannot be the whole story." Graves's face darkened.
"I told you."
"Yes, you told us what made you seem pitiable, not guilty," she interrupted gently.
"But tell me this, who else knew where you kept your chemicals?"
He hesitated. Lydia once helped me sort my cabinet. She's clever with glassware. All eyes turned to Lydia. That was weeks ago, she said coldly.
And I never went near that drawer, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Of course not.
But you did visit Mrs. Fleming's cottage the day she iced the cake, didn't you? Lydia's breath caught.
How did you... Your footprint in her garden path told me. Mud from your aunt's rose bed. Quite distinct. Lydia went very still. Mrs. Fleming gasped.
You were there? Why? To warn you, Lydia said suddenly.
Aunt suspected you meant harm.
I wanted to stop you, Miss Marple's tone softened.
And yet, my dear, in doing so, you stirred the icing to make sure no poison was hidden there.
You meant to save your aunt, and instead ensured every slice was tainted. A silence followed, heavy as judgment. Lydia sank into her chair, trembling.
I only wanted to help.
Miss Marple's voice was kind but grave. So often, my dear, good intentions pave the path to ruin. You spread death in your effort to protect. Dr. Graves covered his face with his hands.
God forgive us all. The rain had ceased.
The candles guttered low, their light unsteady. Inspector Cray rose slowly. Lydia Partridge, you're not guilty of murder, but your interference cost a life. The court will decide what name the law gives that. Miss Marple stood, her expression weary. And so we find that every hand touched the crime in some way. The doctor, through vanity, Mrs. Fleming, through resentment, the colonel, through deceit, and the niece, through misplaced loyalty. Poor Mrs. Partridge, in trying to protect others, invited her own destruction. She looked toward the candle flame, watching it tremble. Such is the price of secrets. Once lit, they burn all who hold them. Outside, thunder rolled once more, distant now, retreating into the hills. Chapter. The dawn that followed was unnaturally still. A mist clung to the hedgerows like ghostly lace, and the church bell tolled 6:30 with a sound that seemed to travel through water. In that quiet hour, St. Mary Mead looked almost innocent again. Cottages dozing under the soft grey light, chimney smoke curling in delicate plumes. Yet within Miss Marple's cottage, a quiet storm was gathering. She sat at her desk, her cup of tea long grown cold, staring at the notes she had rewritten twice already. Each name, each motive, each action crossed and circled in fine pencil. The truth was known now, but justice, she thought, required more than truth. It required understanding. And understanding was not yet complete. There is still one piece out of place, she thought. The doctor's confession was only half a sin, Lydia's interference half an accident. But someone, tied the halves together. Her eyes flicked to the final entry in her notebook. Motive unaccounted, fear. Who feared discovery most? She rose, drew her shawl about her shoulders, and stepped into the morning mist. It was time for her trap. Inspector Cray arrived just as the village was beginning to stir. His face was drawn but alert, his notebook tucked under his arm. "You've the air of someone about to commit mischief, Miss Marple," he said dryly. She smiled. "Only a small necessary mischief, Inspector. I mean to let the truth expose itself, with your cooperation, of course," he sighed. "I've learned not to argue with you. What's the plan?" "I shall arrange a gathering at Mrs. Fleming's this afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the sale of Mrs. Partridge's estate items."
Lydia, the doctor, and the colonel will all attend.
"There will be cake again, of a very particular sort." Cray frowned. "You mean to—" "No poison, of course," she interrupted primly. "Merely imitation."
"Almond essence, to be precise."
"I shall observe who reacts." "And how?" He nodded slowly. "A test of conscience, then?" "Precisely. A guilty heart always betrays itself when the scent of its crime returns." By 4:00, the sky had darkened again, rain whispering lightly against the windows of Mrs. Fleming's parlour. A single candle flickered on the table, illuminating the delicate spread of tea, scones, and a modest almond cake, baked by Miss Marple herself. Mrs. Fleming fussed nervously.
I do wish we hadn't chosen today. It feels
Ominous. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "truth rarely chooses fine weather." The guests arrived in tense procession, Dr. Graves first, pale and hollow-eyed, then Colonel Harcourt, grim and silent, and finally Lydia, her face drawn but defiant. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her tone mild. "I thought we might conclude matters amicably. We've had enough grief in this village to last a generation." Tea was poured, the clink of china unsteady in the silence. Then Miss Marple cut the cake, her knife gliding cleanly through the soft sponge. She served each guest a slice, identical, deliberate. The faint aroma of almonds rose. Dr. Graves hesitated before lifting his fork. Mrs. Fleming's eyes darted to him, then to the cake. The Colonel took a defiant bite. Lydia merely stared at her plate. The silence grew taut. Then suddenly Mrs. Fleming gasped, hand to her chest, and dropped her fork. The Colonel leapt up.
Good God!
Miss Marple remained perfectly calm. No need for alarm. "It is only the scent, Mrs. Fleming. No poison, I assure you. But it seems to have reminded you of something unpleasant." Mrs. Fleming's face flushed scarlet.
It smells the same as that night. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. And I wonder, Mrs. Fleming, why the smell alone should cause such distress, unless your conscience still ties it to guilt. The woman trembled. I didn't know she'd die.
Lydia rose sharply.
You did poison it?
Mrs. Fleming burst into tears.
I only meant to make her ill.
To frighten her, so she'd forgive the debt.
I thought a tiny dose, just enough for sickness. But then she pointed toward Dr. Graves, who stood frozen.
He told me to add a little more, said it would lose potency in the icing. All eyes turned to him. Dr. Graves's voice was hoarse. I told her nothing of the sort. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed.
Ah, but you did.
I believe you advised her quite confidently, Doctor, believing she would act foolishly enough to deliver your own revenge. That way, you could ensure Mrs. Partridge's death while keeping your hands clean. Cray stepped forward, voice firm. So that was it. Manipulation through fear. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. Mrs. Fleming provided the means, Lydia stirred the icing, and Mrs. Partridge ate the slice that Dr. Graves quietly ensured would kill. It was, in truth, a crime of shared vanity, but he was the composer of the piece. Graves's mask broke. He sank into his chair, face pale.
I only wanted to frighten her, he whispered.
She humiliated me, Miss Marple regarded him with sadness. And so you humiliated yourself before God. Inspector Cray moved forward, producing his warrant. Dr. Lionel Graves, I must place you under arrest on suspicion of murder. Mrs. Fleming wept quietly. Lydia sat motionless, her face turned toward the rain-slick window. Miss Marple stood, her small hands clasped before her. I fear, Inspector, that justice will not mend the heart of this village. We're too fond of secrets here. They bloom like foxglove, beautiful and deadly if tasted. Cray nodded somberly. You've done it again, Miss Marple. Though I can't say I envy you the satisfaction. She gave a faint, melancholy smile. Satisfaction, Inspector, is a luxury one must never seek in death. Truth is enough. That evening, after the doctor had been taken away and the others dispersed, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the drizzle. The street lamps glowed dimly, the air rich with the scent of rain and smoke. At her gate, she paused to look back toward the Partridge house, now dark, its windows blind. The faint sound of church bells drifted across the damp fields. Inside, she lit a single candle and poured herself a cup of cocoa. On her desk lay the remnants of her notes, pages filled with tidy script and sorrow. She closed them carefully, as one might a prayer book after confession. Justice has been done, she thought, but goodness, that fragile thing, may not survive it. She sat for a long while in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the candle's flame. Then she whispered, "We set our traps for evil, and it steps willingly into them. Yet who among us escapes our own?" Outside, a nightingale began to sing, a mournful tune, low and distant. Chapter. The following morning brought a deceptive calm, one of those bright, untroubled days when even the ghosts of storms seem to have fled. Sunlight spilled through the curtains of Miss Marple's parlour, illuminating the tea set, the open notebook, and the faint trace of sorrow in her eyes. In St. Mary Mead, the news spread like wildfire. The murderer had been caught. Yet, as Miss Marple knew too well, the truth of a crime is never as simple as its headline. Justice had names and laws, but conscience wrote its verdict in silence. The inspector arrived promptly at 9. He looked older this morning, the lines at his eyes deepened. "He's confessed, Miss Marple," he said wearily. "Said every word you suggested. How he guided Mrs. Fleming into using the poison, encouraged her to increase the dose, watched the whole thing unfold like a stage play. He even admits he suspected Lydia might take the blame." "It's monstrous." Miss Marple folded her hands over the table.
Monstrous, yes.
"But not unexpected. I've seen men destroy themselves with pride before, Inspector. They never see the line between manipulation and murder until they've crossed it." Cray nodded grimly. "You said last night that all hands touched the crime."
"I keep thinking about that. Yes," said Miss Marple softly.
For evil seldom works alone. It borrows fear from one, vanity from another, love from a third.
Each adds their ounce until death becomes a shared creation." She rose and poured tea. "Tell me, what of Mrs. Fleming?"
"She'll face charges of manslaughter, though her cooperation may save her from the gallows. Lydia's case is different. No malice in her actions, only ignorance. She'll stand as witness, not accused." Miss Marple nodded. "Then justice will have its measure. But mercy, I hope, will not be forgotten." That afternoon, a formal inquest was held at the village hall. The rooms smelled faintly of polish and damp wool. A dozen villagers had gathered, murmuring softly as they waited. The coroner presided, spectacles glinting beneath the weak sunlight. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back, her knitting untouched in her lap. Dr. Graves was led in, pale and subdued, yet his posture retained a faint trace of the arrogance that had been his undoing. Mrs. Fleming sat a few rows behind, her eyes red-rimmed. Lydia Partridge, dressed in black, stared straight ahead, her face composed, but her hands trembling in her lap. The coroner began. "It is the finding of this inquest that Beatrice Partridge, aged 80, met her death by poisoning administered through ingestion of potassium cyanide concealed in the icing of a birthday cake. Said poison was introduced under the direction of Dr. Lionel Graves, with the unknowing participation of Beatrice Fleming and Lydia Partridge." A murmur rippled through the hall. Dr. Graves lifted his head, his voice hollow.
"I never meant to kill her."
"You must understand, I loved Lydia." Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, carried across the stillness. "Love, doctor, when stripped of humility, is merely possession. You did not love her. You wished to own her gratitude." He turned toward her, eyes filled with something that was not quite remorse. "And what of her?" He spat. She interfered. She caused it. Miss Marple's gaze did not falter. "Yes, through kindness, a dangerous virtue when paired with ignorance. But she will live to atone. You will not." There was silence, deep and heavy. The coroner cleared his throat and concluded the proceedings. As the villagers filed out, whispers followed, of pity, of horror, of fascination. But Miss Marple remained seated until the room was nearly empty. Only then did she rise, adjusting her shawl, her face pale but resolute. That evening, as twilight sank over the village, Lydia came to see her. The young woman's composure had cracked. Her eyes, shone with restless grief. "I can't bear it, Miss Marple," she whispered. "To think that I helped, even by accident."
I keep hearing Aunt's voice, laughing, then choking. Miss Marple reached out and took her hand.
"My dear, guilt is like ivy. If you let it climb unchecked, it will strangle everything good left within you. You must prune it not by denial, but by deeds." Lydia looked up, bewildered. "Deeds? Devote yourself to the living. Help where others falter. Mrs. Fleming will need kindness in the days to come.
Visit her.
Bring light into her house again." "It is what your aunt would have wished." Lydia nodded faintly. "I will." She hesitated. "Do you believe in forgiveness, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "I believe in repentance. Forgiveness is God's affair, but repentance, that we can manage ourselves." Later that night, Colonel Harcourt stopped by, hat in hand, guilt shadowing his face. "I came to thank you," he said gruffly. "If not for you, the truth would have been buried, and perhaps with more than one body." Miss Marple poured him a brandy. "You've nothing to thank me for, Colonel. You've carried your own share of burden. You allowed yourself to be used, out of pride perhaps, or debt. But you've made amends." He nodded slowly. "Still, I can't stop thinking how she used me, Mrs. Partridge, I mean. Thought herself clever, setting snares for others. And look how it ended." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She meant to protect those she loved. In doing so, she uncovered all that was false around her. The truth was her final triumph. Though it cost her life." The Colonel stared into his glass. "Then God rest her soul. And yours, Miss Marple, for setting the record straight." When he left, the night had turned cool and star-pierced. Later still, Miss Marple sat alone, the candle's flame dancing gently beside her journal. She opened it to a clean page and began to write in her small, elegant hand. There is a peculiar sadness in the uncovering of truth. Each revelation shines a light upon the frailty of human goodness. How quickly it bends under jealousy.
Vanity or pride? The doctor poisoned out of wounded love.
The widow acted from resentment, and the niece from mistaken duty.
None meant death, and yet death came. Intent may not equal guilt, but it opens the door to it. I have learned again that murder is seldom born in darkness.
It begins instead in daylight, in conversation, in civility, in those small offences of the heart that fester, unspoken. She paused, her pen hovering. The clock ticked softly. I sometimes wonder if we who expose evil are not also guilty of disturbing what little peace the world has left. Yet truth, however cold, is the only candle that can pierce deceit. And perhaps that is all we can do. Keep it burning. Even as it flickers low, she signed the entry. Simply E.J. M. The flame trembled, as if in assent. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains, and stood for a long moment at the window, watching the last glimmer of light fade beyond the hills. The air was crisp, scented faintly with autumn wood smoke. In the stillness, her thoughts turned to Mrs. Partridge, imperious, witty, stubbornly alive until the very end. Rest now.
"Dear lady," she whispered.
"Your secrets have found their shadows." Then with a soft sigh, she extinguished the candle. Miss Marple's reflection. The following week passed quietly in St. Mary Mead, a return, or at least a pretence, of ordinary life. The butcher's bell clanged at its usual hour, the vicar's sermons resumed their gentle monotony, and the gossips at the post office found new, smaller scandals to replace the old. Yet beneath the surface calm, something had shifted in the village, a faint reserve, as though the air itself remembered what had been done. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed her knitting and her garden walks. But in her heart lingered the strange weight that always followed the solving of a crime, that melancholy awareness that truth, once revealed, could not undo suffering, nor restore the innocence of ignorance. That evening, she sat at her writing desk, a single candle glowing beside a pot of tea. The mist pressed softly against the window panes, and from the churchyard came the faint rustle of leaves. She took up her fountain pen and opened her journal once more. "It is a curious thing, this business of human wickedness," she wrote. "One expects it in the world, in great cities, in wars, in the acts of the desperate. But to find it here, among tea-sets and rose gardens, is always a small shock. Yet perhaps it should not be. The heart, after all, carries its shadows wherever it goes." Her pen paused. She looked toward the candle flame, its light trembling on the edge of the brass holder. "I think often of Dr. Graves, a man undone by pride, disguised as passion, and of Mrs. Fleming, whose bitterness poisoned her reason long before the cake did, and poor Lydia, whose innocence proved far more dangerous than malice. They are each fragments of the same mirror, reflecting what might lie in any of us if love or vanity were pushed too far." She poured herself a small glass of sherry, not in celebration, but in contemplation. The scent reminded her faintly and ironically of almonds. "In youth," she continued, "we imagine good and evil as opposites. But in age one sees how closely they intertwine, like ivy around a tree, each feeding on the other. One must prune constantly to preserve the trunk of decency, lest it be strangled entirely." Her eyes softened as she looked out upon the village. The moonlight fell upon the gravestones, pale and still. Somewhere a clock struck 9, each chime dissolving into the night. "Perhaps that is why I find no triumph in these investigations. For every mystery solved, another sorrow is born. We name the guilty, yes, but what of the loneliness, the jealousy, the fear that bred them? These remain unseen in the hearts of the living." Miss Marple laid down her pen and leaned back in her chair, listening to the slow tick of the mantel clock. Justice is a flame, she thought, but compassion. Compassion is the wick that must keep it burning. She rose and went to draw the curtains, her shadow gliding across the floor. Outside the night was calm at last, and as the candle burned low, another secret met its shadow. She smiled faintly at the words, whispered them aloud, and closed her journal. Then, as always, she blew out the flame. Candlelight Mysteries channel message if you enjoyed this story. Dear listener, we invite you to linger a moment longer in the quiet glow of the candle, for in every tale of deceit and revelation there lies a mirror, one that reflects not only the villain, but the very soul of those who dare to seek the truth. Subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth, and every flickering flame reveals another shadow waiting to be named. Until next time, keep your hearts watchful and your lights burning low.
Another Secret Fades by Candlelight.